Hi there, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy, often desperate, corners of medieval society, exploring a topic that's rarely discussed in glowing terms, but was a stark reality for many women. How medieval women survived in brothels. Imagine the flickering lamplight of a narrow street, the hushed whispers from behind closed doors, and the pervasive scent of ale and something less savory hanging in the air. This wasn't a world of romanticized figures or grand gestures, but one of raw necessity, where survival often meant making unimaginable choices. You probably wouldn't survive a single night in their shoes without feeling the chilling weight of their reality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For many medieval women, the path into prostitution was less a choice and more a last resort, driven by the relentless squeeze of poverty's grasp, forcing them into desperate choices simply to stay alive. Imagine the gnawing hunger, the cold seeping into your bones, and the sight of your children's empty stomachs. In a society with a sparse social safety net, losing your family, your husband, or your livelihood could quickly push you to the brink. Life, for the vast majority of medieval people, was precarious. A bad harvest, a sudden illness, the death of a male provider, or even a simple misunderstanding with a landlord could plunge a family into destitution. For women, who often had fewer formal avenues for employment and were paid less than men for similar work, economic hardship was particularly acute. If you were a widow with no inherited land, an orphan without kin, or simply a woman from a family too poor to support you, the options for earning a living were incredibly limited. It's a mainstream historical fact that extreme poverty was a primary driver for women entering prostitution in the Middle Ages, as it offered a means of survival when other avenues failed. Think of the brutal arithmetic of survival. Would you starve, or would you take the only path that offered a guaranteed meal, a roof over your head, and perhaps a few coins? It was a decision born not of desire, but of sheer, unyielding need. The fear wasn't just of judgment, but of the very real possibility of dying on the streets. It's a quirky tidbit that in some medieval towns, sumptuary laws dictated what clothing people of different social classes could wear. But ironically, prostitutes were sometimes explicitly excluded from these rules, allowing them to wear more colorful or fashionable attire, perhaps as a form of visual advertisement, or simply because their social standing placed them outside traditional class structures. Historians still argue whether the apparent freedom of dress for prostitutes was a subtle form of public shaming, or if it genuinely offered them a unique, albeit stigmatized, form of personal expression. This desperate scramble for survival meant that for many women, the doors of the brothel, while morally condemned, represented a grim sanctuary from starvation. You were choosing the lesser of two evils, a chilling reality that underscored the harshness of medieval life. Building on the crushing weight of poverty, another significant push factor for women entering medieval brothels was social displacement, having no other path to economic stability or a place within the rigidly structured society. Imagine being cast adrift, cut off from your family or community, perhaps due to scandal, a broken engagement, or simply the sheer anonymity of growing urban centers, leaving you with nowhere else to turn. Medieval society was built on networks of family, lord, guild, and parish. If you fell outside these protective structures, your vulnerability increased exponentially. Women who were orphaned young or whose families collapsed due to famine or war often found themselves without social support. Similarly, if you committed a social transgression, like having an illegitimate child, or if you were simply an outsider arriving in a new, crowded city, the traditional avenues of domestic service or craft guilds might be closed off to you. It's a mainstream historical fact that social displacement, including widowhood, abandonment, and migration to cities, significantly contributed to women's entry into prostitution in medieval urban centers. The fear, then, was that of utter destitution and social ostracism. Without a family to shelter you, a husband to support you, or a master to employ you in a recognized trade, you were incredibly exposed. The brothel, despite its ignominy, sometimes offered a perverse kind of community and a guaranteed, albeit precarious, livelihood. It was a place where, ironically, your social exclusion from respectable society meant you were included in a different, liminal sphere. Imagine the cold reality of knocking on doors, seeking honest work, only to be turned away repeatedly, until the brothel's door became the only one that opened. It's a quirky tidbit that in some medieval cities, stranger women or recent migrants were disproportionately represented among prostitutes, highlighting how difficult it was for those without established social ties to find legitimate work. Historians still argue whether the anonymity of large medieval cities made it easier for women to enter prostitution without immediate community detection, or if it simply made them more vulnerable to exploitation. This lack of integration into conventional society left many women with few, if any, alternatives. The path to the brothel was often paved with the closing of all other doors, a desperate journey of elimination until the only viable option remaining was one that society simultaneously condemned and utilized. So, for many, choosing this life wasn't a rebellion against norms, but a tragic concession to a system that had left them with literally no other way to survive. You were pushed to the margins, and from the margins, you found a way to exist, however grim that existence might be. It was a societal pressure cooker, and you were one of the unfortunate few who ended up boiling over into the only available escape valve, stemming directly from poverty and social displacement. The stark reality for many medieval women was having limited options, making prostitution one of the few, if not the only, avenues for achieving even a semblance of economic independence. Imagine the profound hunger for control over your own survival, even if that control came at an immense personal and social cost. For a woman in the Middle Ages, formal employment opportunities were incredibly restricted. Most work was agricultural, domestic service, or within craft guilds. Guilds were largely male-dominated, and while some women worked alongside their husbands or fathers in trades, establishing their own independent business was rare and often required significant capital or family connections. Domestic service, while common, offered low wages and often meant living under strict supervision with little autonomy. If you weren't born into a family with land or connections, and you lacked the means to enter a recognized trade, your choices dwindled rapidly. It's a mainstream historical fact that access to formal, independent employment for medieval women, particularly unmarried or unattached women, was severely limited, pushing many towards informal or illicit economies. The fear, then, was of perpetual dependence and utter powerlessness. Prostitution, paradoxically, offered a perverse form of economic agency. You might not own property or join a guild, but you controlled your own labor, at least in theory, and directly receive payments for your services. This could mean the difference between starvation and survival, or even, for a very few, accumulating enough money to escape the life. Imagine the grim satisfaction of holding actual coins in your hand, knowing they were yours, earned through your own effort, however unsavory that effort might be. It's a quirky tidbit that in some towns, prostitutes were permitted to carry knives, a rare privilege for women, perhaps as a means of self-defense in their dangerous profession, or as a symbol of their marginalized status. Historians still argue whether the apparent economic independence offered by prostitution was genuine, or if women were simply exchanging one form of male control pimps, brothel owners, for another. While deeply stigmatized, this profession offered cash income, a crucial element in an increasingly monetized medieval economy. It meant you weren't beholden to a single lord for land, or a single master for a pittance wage. You could, in theory, earn enough to buy your own food, pay for lodging, and avoid utter destitution. This desperate yearning for self-sufficiency, for the power to simply keep yourself alive, drove many women to choose this difficult path. So, for those on the margins, prostitution, grim as it was, sometimes represented the only available avenue to carve out any measure of economic independence in a world where respectable opportunities for women were tragically few. It was a trade-off, certainly, but one that many felt compelled to make. While driven by desperation, the surprising reality for many medieval women in the profession was that some brothels were in fact regulated brothels, operating with a degree of official tolerance. Imagine a system where the very authorities who condemned your profession also derived income from it, creating a bizarre duality of sin and sanctioned commerce. This official oversight, while not eliminating danger, did introduce a peculiar layer of control and, in some cases, offered limited protection. Many medieval towns, particularly larger urban centers, recognized the inevitability of prostitution, and, rather than attempting to eradicate it entirely, chose to regulate it. This meant establishing designated areas for brothels, setting specific opening and closing hours, and sometimes even dictating prices for services. The rationale was often twofold: to control public order and to generate revenue for the municipality through taxes or licensing fees. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval European cities, including London, Paris, and Bologna, officially regulated prostitution, demonstrating a pragmatic, if morally conflicted, approach to the trade. The fear, however, was that this tolerance was always conditional and often came with a heavy price. Regulation meant you were constantly under official scrutiny, your movements and activities monitored, while theoretically offering some protection against arbitrary violence or theft, as the authorities had an interest in maintaining order in a tax-paying enterprise. It also solidified your marginalized status. Imagine being forced to live and work only in designated areas, often on the outskirts of town, visible to all as an outcast. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval brothel regulations even stipulated that the women working there had to be unmarried or foreigners, attempting to prevent respectable local women from engaging in the trade and to control social boundaries. Historians still argue whether municipal regulation of brothels genuinely improved the safety and working conditions for the women, or if it merely formalized their exploitation and made them easier to tax. This system of official tolerance created a strange environment. On one hand, it acknowledged the economic reality of your profession and, in theory, offered a modicum of stability compared to illicit, unregulated work. On the other hand, it constantly reinforced your social condemnation. You were tolerated, but never truly accepted. So, while working in a regulated brothel might have offered a faint glimmer of security, it came hand in hand with constant supervision and the unwavering societal judgment that ensured your life remained precarious. A licensed outcast in the heart of the city. It was like being given a ticket to a show, but the show was your own life, and the audience was always judging. Among the most famous examples of officially sanctioned establishments, the Southwark stews in London offer a vivid glimpse into the reality of rules and revenue for medieval women in brothels. Imagine crossing London Bridge and heading south of the Thames into a district known for its bustling inns, bear-baiting pits, and the infamous stews, where your life was governed by a peculiar set of ordinances. The Southwark stews were a cluster of licensed brothels operating under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, making them a unique example of ecclesiastical, rather than purely municipal, regulation. These establishments were not hidden. They were a well-known part of London's social and economic landscape. The bishop derived significant income from their operation, effectively taxing the women who worked there. This created a paradoxical situation where a high-ranking church official profited directly from a trade condemned by the church. It's a mainstream historical fact that the stews of Southwark were a famous example of regulated medieval brothels, generating considerable income for their ecclesiastical landlord. The rules governing the Southwark stews were extensive, covering everything from working hours, no work on Sundays or holy days, for instance, to hygiene, and even prohibiting the sale of food or drink to prevent competition with other local businesses. While some rules, like preventing women from forcibly detaining customers, might have offered a minimal degree of protection, many others were designed to control the women and ensure the efficient flow of revenue. Imagine being told exactly when you could work, when you had to rest, and even how to conduct yourself, all under the watchful eye of the establishment's owners and the bishop's officials. It's a quirky tidbit that some of these regulations specifically forbade bad language or brawling within the stews, suggesting that the authorities were keen to maintain a veneer of order, even in a place of perceived moral laxity. Historians still argue whether the detailed regulations of the Southwark stews offered any real improvement to the women's lives, or if they primarily served the interests of the powerful figures who profited from them. This environment, while legal, was far from secure. You were a source of income, and your well-being was secondary to the continued flow of that revenue. The constant presence of rules meant constant scrutiny, and the financial arrangement, while perhaps guaranteeing some payment, also ensured you remained tied to the establishment. You were part of a system that tolerated you for profit, a chilling reminder that your economic role came at the cost of genuine freedom and respect. So, in the Southwark stews, you operated under a strange contract, officially recognized, financially exploited, and always aware that your worth was measured in the coins you generated for those in power. It was like being a tax-paying citizen, but for a government that openly condemned your existence. Despite any official regulations or the facade of order, the grim reality for women in medieval brothels was the pervasive threat of violence and abuse, a constant threat that underscored the inherent dangers of their profession. Imagine the chilling fear that would grip you each night, knowing that any customer, any argument, or even a simple misunderstanding could quickly escalate into physical harm, with little hope of recourse. While some regulations, like those in Southwark, ostensibly aimed to protect women from violent clients, these were often difficult to enforce in practice. Prostitutes, by virtue of their marginalized social status, were highly vulnerable. They lacked the legal standing and social support of respectable women, making them easy targets for exploitation and violence from clients, pimps, or even the brothel owners themselves. Their complaints might be dismissed, or worse, lead to further punishment rather than protection. It's a mainstream historical fact that women in prostitution faced significant risks of physical violence, sexual assault, and exploitation. Despite sporadic attempts at regulation, the fear was not just of physical injury, but of psychological torment and the constant degradation that often accompanied their work. Imagine enduring verbal abuse, intimidation, and the constant threat of force, knowing that your body was a commodity and your personal safety was often secondary to the whims of others. This environment fostered a deep sense of powerlessness. It's a quirky tidbit that in some rare instances, medieval court records show prostitutes bringing complaints against violent clients, sometimes even successfully, though such cases were likely the exception rather than the rule, highlighting the immense courage required to seek justice. Historians still argue whether the official recognition of brothels by authorities inadvertently made women more vulnerable by normalizing their exploitation, or if it provided any real, albeit limited, avenues for seeking help. Moreover, if you worked independently or in unregulated establishments, the dangers were even greater. There was no overarching authority to appeal to, no pretense of protection. You were entirely at the mercy of your clients and the criminal elements that often preyed on vulnerable women. This constant exposure to potential harm, this knowledge that your body was often unprotected in a brutal world, was a terrifying burden. So, while you might have found economic survival in the brothel, it came at the cost of your personal safety and dignity, making every day a precarious gamble against violence. It was like living in a perpetual dark alley where danger could emerge from any shadow, and your cries for help might simply echo unheard. In the often precarious world of medieval brothels, survival was a daily calculation, and one of the practical aspects you would constantly navigate concerned the financial arrangements, particularly how some establishments managed by pooling earnings. Imagine the system where your individual payments were collected, then distributed, offering a semblance of order but often reinforcing your dependence on the brothel owner. While independent prostitutes existed, many women worked within brothels that had established methods for handling client payments. One common system involved pooling all the money earned by the women over a specific period, perhaps a day or a week. This collective income would then be divided, with a significant portion going to the brothel owner, often called the madame, or pimp, for rent, protection, and operational costs, and the remainder distributed among the women. This system aimed to ensure a more consistent income for the women, as slow nights for one might be offset by busier nights for others. But it also meant less individual control over earnings. It's a mainstream historical fact that many medieval brothels operated on a system of shared earnings, where a portion went to the establishment and the rest was divided among the women. The fear, however, was that this pooling system could be easily manipulated. The brothel owner held all the cards, controlling the accounting and the final distribution. You might suspect that you weren't receiving your fair share, but had little recourse to challenge the figures. Imagine the frustration and helplessness of knowing your hard-earned money was being held and portioned out by someone else, whose honesty you might constantly doubt. It's a quirky tidbit that in some rare medieval legal disputes, women from brothels would actually bring cases against their madams for withholding payments or charging exorbitant fees. highlighting the attempts, however difficult, to assert their economic rights. Historians still argue whether such pooling systems were designed primarily to exploit the women, or if they offered a necessary form of economic stability in an unpredictable profession. Moreover, the financial arrangements often included deductions for lodging, food, clothing, and even fines for breaking house rules, further diminishing your actual take-home earnings. While the system provided a roof over your head and a meal, it also kept you in a perpetual state of financial dependency, making it incredibly difficult to save money or gain true independence. So, while the idea of pooled earnings might sound like a form of collective security for you, a woman in a medieval brothel, it often translated into a subtle form of economic control, where your daily labor filled the coffers of others, leaving you with just enough to survive, but rarely enough to truly escape. It was like working for commission, but your boss decided the commission rate after you'd already done the work, and then charged you for the air you breathed. Despite any semblance of order provided by financial arrangements, the overarching reality for you as a medieval woman in a brothel was your limited control over your own life, perpetually subject to the madame's authority and the establishment's rules. Imagine the constant feeling of being owned, your movements, your time, and even your personal choices dictated by another, even as you ostensibly worked for yourself. The brothel owner, often referred to as the madame or pimp, held considerable power over the women in her establishment. She provided the lodging, the clientele, and the often flimsy protection from external threats. In return, she exacted strict obedience. Rules dictated everything: when you could work, when you could leave the premises, who you could associate with, and even how you presented yourself. Disobeying these rules could lead to fines, reduced earnings, or even physical punishment and expulsion, leaving you even more vulnerable. It's a mainstream historical fact that brothel madames exercised significant control over the lives and earnings of the women in their establishments, often holding them in a state of effective bondage. The fear stemming from this authority was profound. You were at the mercy of your madame's temperament and financial acumen. If she was capricious, cruel, or simply dishonest, you had little recourse. Imagine being utterly dependent on someone who could, at any moment, cast you out onto the streets or make your life unbearable within the brothel's walls. This dependence fostered a pervasive sense of powerlessness. It's a quirky tidbit that some madames, in an attempt to maintain a competitive edge or attract specific clientele, would enforce certain standards of dress or hygiene among their women, transforming the women into branded assets under their control. Historians still argue whether the madame's authority, despite its exploitative nature, sometimes offered a measure of stability and protection for women in a dangerous profession, or if it simply replaced direct street exploitation with institutionalized control. Moreover, while you might have some negotiation power with clients, your ultimate working conditions were set by the madame. She determined the house cut of your earnings, the quality of your lodging, and the level of security provided. This constant oversight meant that true autonomy was an illusion. So, for you, a woman trying to survive in a medieval brothel, the madame's authority was an omnipresent force, a constant reminder that your survival, however precarious, came at the cost of genuine self-determination. You might have dreamed of freedom, but you were fundamentally bound by the unspoken contract of the house, perpetually dancing to the tune of whoever held the purse strings and the power. It was like being an independent contractor, except your boss was also your landlord, your debt collector, and your personal jailer. Amidst the oppressive authority of the madame and the precarious nature of your existence, a persistent, if often faint, glimmer of hope for you as a medieval woman in a brothel was saving for dowries, offering a desperate hope for escape from the life you were trapped in. Imagine meticulously stashing away every spare coin, envisioning a future where you could leave the brothel, marry, and finally reintegrate into a more respectable society. For medieval women, a dowry was a crucial component of marriage. It was a sum of money, goods, or property that a bride brought to her husband upon marriage, often intended to provide for her in widowhood or to support the new household. For women from humble backgrounds, accumulating a dowry through traditional means was difficult, but for women in prostitution, whose work could generate cash, it represented a tangible, if distant, pathway to a different life. This hope of accumulating enough capital to marry, even if it was to a man of modest means, was a powerful motivator. It's a mainstream historical fact that acquiring a dowry was a common aspiration for women in various marginalized professions, including prostitution, as it offered a chance at social mobility and legitimate marriage. The fear, however, was that saving enough money was incredibly difficult. Between the madame's cut, daily expenses for food and lodging, clothing, and any unexpected illnesses or fines, very little cash would be left over. You were constantly on a financial treadmill, making it challenging to build up any significant savings. Imagine the frustration of seeing your earnings vanish, knowing each setback pushed your dream of escape further away. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval wills or legal documents occasionally record small bequests made by former prostitutes to churches or charitable institutions, perhaps as an act of penance or a quiet acknowledgement of their past life and a testament to the rare instances of financial accumulation. Historians still argue whether the dream of saving for a dowry was a realistic goal for many women in prostitution, or if it was largely an unattainable fantasy that kept them working within the system. Moreover, even with a dowry, finding a husband willing to overlook your past profession was a significant hurdle. While some men, particularly those of lower social standing, might be swayed by the financial incentive, the social stigma would still linger, making a truly respectable marriage challenging. The fear wasn't just about saving money, but about the enduring prejudice that could still block your path to a new life. So, for you, a medieval woman toiling in a brothel, the dowry was a fragile beacon of hope, a dream of freedom purchased coin by painful coin, a testament to your desperate desire for a life beyond the shadows. It was a long, arduous climb out of a very deep well, and often the rope felt like it was fraying. For those who sought not just a new life, but spiritual redemption alongside social reintegration, the medieval period offered the difficult but promising option of Magdalen homes, representing a potential path to redemption for women seeking to leave prostitution. Imagine a cloistered haven, where prayer and honest labor replaced the grim routines of the brothel, offering a chance to wash away the sins of the past and rebuild a life. If you could only gain entry, named after Mary Magdalene, a biblical figure, often associated with reformed sinners. These institutions, also known as Magdalene asylums, refuges, or hospitals, were established by religious orders or charitable individuals. Their primary purpose was to provide shelter, spiritual guidance, and vocational training for women who wished to abandon prostitution. Here, you would engage in prayer, learn skills like spinning, weaving, or sewing, and live a life of piety. preparing you for re-entry into society, perhaps as a domestic servant, a laundress, or even a nun in a less strict order. It's a mainstream historical fact that Magdalene homes existed across medieval Europe, offering a structured environment for women to leave prostitution and seek spiritual and social rehabilitation. The fear, however, was that gaining admission to these homes was incredibly difficult, and proving your past was a double-edged sword. Competition for entry was fierce, as spots were limited and demand was high. You had to demonstrate genuine remorse and a sincere desire for reform, often undergoing interviews or proving your commitment over a period of time. Paradoxically, you also had to prove you were a former prostitute to be admitted, meaning you had to publicly acknowledge your stigmatized past to gain access to a better future. Imagine the humiliation of confessing your history to a panel of stern-faced religious figures, knowing that your admission depended on recounting your most painful experiences. It's a quirky tidbit that some Magdalene homes had strict rules about visitors and contact with the outside world, designed to prevent women from relapsing, but also inadvertently creating another form of confinement. Historians still argue whether Magdalene homes genuinely empowered women to escape exploitation, or if they merely exchanged one form of institutional control for another, albeit with a religious veneer. Furthermore, even if admitted, life in a Magdalene home was austere, disciplined, and focused on penance. It was not a life of luxury, but one of rigorous spiritual and physical labor. The path to redemption was long and challenging, and the social stigma, while perhaps lessened, might never fully disappear. So, while Magdalene homes offered a beacon of hope for escape and spiritual renewal, they also represented a formidable challenge, requiring profound commitment and the willingness to confront and reveal a painful past. For you, a medieval woman, trapped in the brothel, it was a distant, arduous climb towards a new life. A path of penance that promised salvation, but demanded everything. The allure of Magdalene homes, while strong, was tempered by a grim reality for you as a medieval woman seeking escape. Fierce competition for limited spots, making entry difficulties a constant barrier to redemption. Imagine the long lines, the desperate pleas, and the crushing disappointment of being turned away, realizing that even your sincere desire for a better life might not be enough. Magdalene homes were charitable institutions, often funded by donations and managed by religious orders. Their capacity was limited by available resources, endowments, and the number of nuns or staff willing to oversee them. As a result, the number of women they could admit was far smaller than the number who desperately sought refuge from prostitution. This created intense competition for entry, making the application process rigorous and often heartbreaking. It's a mainstream historical fact that resources for social welfare institutions, including those for reformed prostitutes, were scarce in the Middle Ages, leading to high demand and limited availability. The fear, then, was of being deemed unworthy or simply unlucky. You had to convince the administrators of your genuine repentance and your commitment to reform, often through a period of probation or interviews. But even with the most heartfelt plea, the simple lack of space or funds could mean your rejection. Imagine the frustration of having found a potential lifeline, only to have it snatched away by the sheer numbers of others equally desperate. It's a quirky tidbit that some Magdalene homes prioritized women who were younger or who had only recently entered prostitution, believing they had a higher chance of successful rehabilitation, further limiting the options for older or more established women in the trade. Historians still argue whether the strict admission criteria of Magdalene homes were genuinely about ensuring successful reform, or if they sometimes reflected societal prejudices against certain types of women or degrees of past sin. Moreover, if you were rejected, you were often left with no clear alternative. The brothel, despite its dangers, was still your only source of income. This meant a return to the very life you were trying to escape, with your hopes dashed and your vulnerability, perhaps even heightened by your failed attempt at reform. The difficulty of gaining entry underscored just how trapped many women were. So, for you, a medieval woman yearning for a life beyond the brothel, the Magdalene home represented a distant, tantalizing promise, but one shadowed by the very real possibility of fierce competition and bitter disappointment. It was like trying to get into an exclusive club, but the only currency was your sincerity, and there were far too many sincere people. When formal avenues of escape, like Magdalene homes, were closed, some medieval women in prostitution resorted to more desperate and unconventional tactics, including the use of disguises as a means of evading detection and prosecution. Imagine meticulously altering your appearance, perhaps donning male attire or adopting a persona, hoping to blend into the bustling streets and disappear from the watchful eyes of authorities or vengeful clients. In medieval cities, particularly those with regulated brothels, prostitutes were often required to wear specific clothing or identifying marks, or to live within designated areas. This made them highly visible and easily identifiable to law enforcement, moral crusaders, and the general public. To escape this visibility, or to engage in illicit, unregulated work that offered more freedom or better pay, some women attempted to hide their identity. This might involve dressing in clothing typically worn by men, or by adopting a different hairstyle or mannerisms to avoid immediate recognition. It's a mainstream historical fact that sumptuary laws and other regulations often attempted to control the appearance of prostitutes, which in turn led some to try and evade these restrictions through disguise. The fear, of course, was the immense risk involved. If discovered, disguises could lead to severe penalties, including fines, public shaming, imprisonment, or even harsher punishments for attempting to circumvent legal or social norms. Imagine the constant tension of walking through a crowded market, knowing that a single suspicious glance or an unlucky encounter could expose you, undoing all your efforts. It's a quirky tidbit that medieval court records occasionally describe instances of women, including prostitutes, being arrested for dressing in male attire, highlighting the existence of this clandestine practice and the authorities' efforts to suppress it. Historians still argue whether such acts of disguise were primarily about economic survival, or if they sometimes represented a subtle form of social defiance against rigid gender expectations. Moreover, while a disguise might offer temporary anonymity, it rarely provided a long-term solution. It was a fleeting escape, fraught with peril, that rarely led to true, stable reintegration into respectable society. The fundamental issues of poverty and social stigma remained. So, for you, a medieval woman attempting to escape the confines of your profession through disguise, it was a high-stakes gamble, a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of personal freedom and safety by becoming someone else, however temporarily. It was like trying to disappear in plain sight, a nerve-wracking performance where the audience was always watching for a slip. Beyond the desperate measure of disguises, another precarious path that some medieval women in brothels attempted as a means of survival or escape was through marriage, a strategy that sometimes offered a new life, but often came with its own set of complications and the grim reality of new control. Imagine the complex calculations involved, weighing the perceived stability of a husband against the possible exchange of one form of bondage for another. For a woman trapped in prostitution, marriage to almost any man, even one of humble means, offered a theoretical escape from the brothel and a return to respectable society. A husband, however poor, provided a legal identity, a social place, and a potential family unit which were often denied to single, unattached women in the trade. This desire for legitimacy and a conventional life was a powerful pull. It's a mainstream historical fact that for many medieval women, marriage was the primary, if not only, avenue for social and economic security, and this extended even to those seeking to leave marginalized professions. The fear, however, was that such marriages were often not about love or partnership, but pragmatic arrangements. You might marry a client, a petty criminal, or even, in grim ironic twists, your own pimp or brothel owner. Such a marriage could simply transfer your control from one exploiter to another, or bind you more permanently to the very world you sought to escape. Imagine the bitter realization that your supposed freedom had simply led you into a different kind of cage, perhaps with even fewer avenues for true autonomy. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval church courts, in their efforts to regulate morality, would specifically investigate marriages involving former prostitutes, looking for signs of coercion or continued illicit activity, highlighting the scrutiny such unions faced. Historians still argue whether marriages between prostitutes and their exploiters offered any genuine improvement in the women's lives, or if they merely formalized their subservience and limited their ability to leave the life entirely. Moreover, the social stigma of your past profession would likely follow you. Even if married, you might struggle to gain full acceptance within a new community, facing whispers, judgment, and exclusion. Your husband, too, might hold your past over you, or society might pressure him to control you more strictly. So, while marriage could offer a perceived refuge from the immediate dangers of the brothel, it was often a perilous leap into a new, uncertain future, where the chains of control might simply be reforged with a different, more socially acceptable kind of metal. It was a trade of one difficult situation for another, with a heavy dose of be careful what you wish for lingering in the air. Beyond the confines of regulated brothels or forced marriages, some medieval women in prostitution managed to carve out a precarious existence through home-based prostitution, a strategy that offered the subtle advantage of fewer interactions, with official oversight and potentially more control over their own lives. Imagine a woman discreetly welcoming clients into her humble dwelling, perhaps in a quiet alley, far from the bustling, conspicuous stews, hoping to avoid unwanted attention. This form of prostitution operated largely outside official regulation. Women might rent a room or a small house and conduct their business there, often catering to a more limited, perhaps more discreet, clientele. The advantage was a degree of anonymity and independence that was impossible in a large, licensed brothel. You controlled your own hours, your own prices within limits, and your own client interactions without a madame taking a large cut or enforcing rigid rules. This also potentially reduced your direct exposure to the public shaming associated with being openly identified as a prostitute in a designated area. It's a mainstream historical fact that unregistered, home-based prostitution was common in medieval towns, existing alongside officially regulated establishments. The fear, however, was that this independence came with increased personal risk. Without the protection of a brothel owner, however exploitative, you were more vulnerable to violent clients, theft, or arbitrary arrest by moralizing authorities. Imagine the constant vigilance required, the careful screening of potential clients, and the quiet dread of a knock on the door that wasn't a paying customer but an official or a troublemaker. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval urban regulations, specifically, targeted single women living alone or women of ill repute who were suspected of operating discreetly from their homes, indicating authorities were aware of and attempted to curb this less visible form of the trade. Historians still argue whether home-based prostitution offered genuine autonomy and safety improvements for the women, or if it simply shifted the risks from institutional exploitation to more direct, personal dangers. Moreover, while you might attract less attention from authorities than those in public brothels, the social stigma remained, and you lived with the constant fear of discovery by neighbors or community members, which could lead to eviction or social ostracism. Your life was a delicate balance of discretion and necessity, always on edge, always aware that your livelihood depended on remaining beneath the official radar. So, for you, a medieval woman choosing home-based prostitution, it was a strategy for survival that offered a tantalizing taste of freedom and greater control, but also demanded perpetual caution and a heightened awareness of every shadow, every strange sound, and every unfamiliar face that passed your window. It was like running a secret business from your living room, always keeping one ear open for the doorbell, just in case it wasn't a delivery. Closely tied to the discreet nature of home-based prostitution, medieval women in the trade also employed strategies to manage their religious and social standing, sometimes adhering to what we might call confessional lines as a way of navigating morality and avoiding legal repercussions. Imagine yourself as a woman walking a tightrope between earning a living and attempting to preserve some semblance of spiritual peace, or at least avoid the direct wrath of the church. Medieval society was deeply religious, and prostitution was unequivocally condemned by the church as a grave sin. This created a profound moral dilemma for women in the profession, who, despite their circumstances, were often still believers. Confessional lines refer to the informal ways in which women might try to limit their activities or interactions, to avoid what they perceived as the gravest sins, or to make their eventual penance less severe. This could mean avoiding certain holy days, refraining from working near churches, or perhaps even declining specific acts they considered more morally egregious. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval people, including those in marginalized professions, lived within a pervasive religious framework, and fears of damnation were very real. The fear, then, was not just of earthly punishment, but of eternal damnation. For a woman trying to survive, the constant internal conflict between economic necessity and deeply ingrained religious teachings must have been immense. Imagine the guilt, the self-condemnation, and the desperate hope for forgiveness, even as you continued to engage in the very acts deemed sinful. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval wills left by women identified as prostitutes would include large bequests to local churches or convents, perhaps as a form of posthumous penance, or a desperate attempt to secure prayers for their souls and lessen their time in purgatory. Historians still argue whether the Church's condemnation of prostitution, while morally consistent, inadvertently pushed women deeper into illicit, less regulated forms of the trade, making them even more vulnerable. Furthermore, adhering to these confessional lines could also be a pragmatic strategy to avoid legal or social scrutiny. By appearing to respect religious boundaries, you might lessen the likelihood of being targeted by moral crusaders or overzealous officials. It was a delicate dance between necessity and perceived piety. So, for you, a medieval woman navigating this difficult profession, your survival was not just about money, but also about the complex inner world of faith and fear, constantly trying to reconcile your means of livelihood with the moral strictures of your deeply religious society. It was like trying to walk a very thin plank over a very deep, fiery pit, hoping your balance held. Despite any personal attempts to navigate morality or the pragmatic benefits of discretion, the most pervasive and inescapable burden for medieval women in brothels was the profound and relentless social stigma, leaving them as a perpetual outcast in society. Imagine the invisible mark you carried, the whispers and averted gazes, knowing that your profession condemned you to the lowest rung of the social ladder, regardless of your personal character or reasons for entering the trade. Prostitution was universally condemned by the church and, while sometimes tolerated or regulated by secular authorities for practical reasons, it was never socially accepted. Women who engaged in it were seen as fallen, morally corrupt, and a danger to the spiritual fabric of the community. This stigma was not just about reputation. It had tangible consequences, affecting your ability to marry, to live in certain areas, or even to be buried in consecrated ground. It's a mainstream historical fact that women involved in prostitution faced extreme social ostracism and moral condemnation in medieval Europe. The fear, then, was of perpetual judgment and the profound isolation that came with it. You lived in a world where you were simultaneously utilized and despised. Imagine the shame, the loneliness, and the realization that even if you managed to leave the profession, the mark of your past would likely follow you for the rest of your life. This social death was often as terrifying as any physical threat. It's a quirky tidbit that in some medieval towns, prostitutes were compelled to wear distinctive clothing, often brightly colored or with specific emblems designed to publicly identify and shame them, forcing them into a visible state of outcast status. Historians still argue whether such public shaming rituals truly deterred women from entering prostitution, or if they merely reinforced their marginalization and made escape more difficult. Moreover, this stigma extended to your family. If your origins were known, your relatives might also face social disapproval, forcing further separation or estrangement. This societal condemnation meant that even your occasional acts of charity or piety might be viewed with suspicion. You were forever branded an object of moral disdain. So, for you, a medieval woman enduring the brothel life, the social stigma was an inescapable cage, an invisible barrier that separated you from the respectable world, making true acceptance an integration, a distant, almost impossible dream. It was like living with a giant neon sign above your head, broadcasting your profession to everyone, everywhere you went, even when you wished for nothing more than to disappear. Adding to the crushing weight of social stigma, a constant and terrifying concern for you as a medieval woman in a brothel was the severe health risks. Living perpetually under disease's shadow, imagine the pervasive dread of contagious illnesses, the lack of effective treatments, and the devastating impact that sickness could have on your ability to work and simply survive. Medieval towns, even prosperous ones, were generally unsanitary places, with poor waste disposal, contaminated water, and crowded living conditions, all ripe for the spread of disease. For women in brothels, these risks were amplified. Their profession involved close physical contact with numerous individuals, many of whom might carry various infections. There was no understanding of germ theory, antibiotics were centuries away, and even basic hygiene was often lacking. Venereal diseases, though not understood in their modern context, were certainly prevalent and devastating, alongside other common medieval ailments like tuberculosis, dysentery, and various fevers. It's a mainstream historical fact that women in prostitution faced significantly higher risks of contracting and succumbing to various diseases due to their living and working conditions. The fear wasn't just of suffering, but of economic ruin. A serious illness meant you couldn't work, which meant no income, and rapidly, no food or lodging. Without a social safety net, prolonged sickness was often a death sentence, leading to starvation or being cast out onto the streets. Imagine the desperate scramble to hide your symptoms, to push through the pain, knowing that any visible sign of illness could mean losing your livelihood. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval brothel regulations did include provisions for inspecting the health of the women, or for refusing clients with visible signs of illness, not primarily out of concern for the women, but to protect the establishment's reputation and client base. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates among medieval prostitutes were primarily due to infectious diseases, or if other factors like violence, malnutrition, and exposure also played significant roles. Moreover, the lack of effective medical care meant that even minor ailments could quickly become debilitating, and chronic conditions could render you permanently unable to work. There was no sick pay, no healthcare system to fall back on. Your body was your capital, and illness was a direct threat to your very means of survival. So, for you, a medieval woman in a brothel, disease was a constant, terrifying companion, an invisible threat lurking in every interaction, a chilling reminder of the fragility of your existence and the brutal consequences of even a common cough or fever. It was a constant game of Russian roulette with your own health, and the chambers were always loaded. Adding to the silent terror of disease, the very act that defined your profession could also bring a deeply feared and often devastating consequence: childbirth, leading to unwanted consequences that profoundly altered and often worsened your already precarious life. Imagine the dawning realization of a missed cycle, the quiet dread, and the terrifying questions of what a pregnancy and subsequent child would mean for your struggle for survival. Contraception in the Middle Ages was rudimentary and unreliable, and for women in prostitution, the risk of pregnancy was inherent to their daily work. An unwanted pregnancy could be catastrophic. It meant a period when you could not work, a loss of income, and the immense social and economic burden of caring for a child with no formal support system. You faced the immediate challenge of maintaining your livelihood while your body changed, followed by the daunting prospect of supporting a newborn in a world that offered little mercy to unwed mothers, especially those in your profession. It's a mainstream historical fact that unwanted pregnancies were a significant problem for women in medieval prostitution, leading to severe hardship. The fear wasn't just of the physical ordeal of childbirth itself. Remember our earlier discussion about high maternal mortality rates, but of the almost insurmountable challenges of motherhood in your circumstances. Imagine trying to care for an infant in a brothel, or the agonizing decision of what to do with a newborn when you could barely support yourself. There were no maternity leaves, no public assistance for single mothers. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval charities or hospitals did accept abandoned infants, but taking a child there often meant a permanent separation and for the mother, a public acknowledgement of her sin. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of infanticide or child abandonment among women in prostitution was primarily due to economic desperation, or if it also reflected a societal lack of support structures for vulnerable mothers. Moreover, the presence of a child would further cement your social ostracism, making any hope of leaving the profession or achieving respectable marriage even more difficult. Your child, born into your stigmatized world, would also face a life of hardship and judgment, a crushing burden for any mother. So, for you, a medieval woman in a brothel, pregnancy and childbirth were not joyous events, but rather a profound source of anxiety, threatening to deepen your poverty and bind you even more tightly to a life you desperately sought to escape. It was a cruel twist of fate, where the act of bringing new life into the world often meant an intensification of your own grim struggle for existence. Following the grim reality of unwanted childbirth, the most heartbreaking and often unavoidable consequence for you as a medieval woman in prostitution was the agonizing decision regarding abandoned children, a stark and painful manifestation of your grim reality. Imagine the wrenching choice, torn between the desperate need to survive and the profound instinct to care for your offspring, knowing that in your circumstances, one often precluded the other, given the extreme poverty, social stigma, and lack of support for single mothers, particularly those in the sex trade. Keeping and raising a child was often an impossibility. A newborn would represent an unbearable financial burden, making it impossible to work and risking starvation for both mother and child. This brutal economic reality often forced women into the agonizing decision to abandon their infants, leaving them at the doors of churches, convents, or municipal foundling hospitals in the desperate hope that they would receive care and perhaps a chance at a better life. It's a mainstream historical fact that child abandonment, particularly of infants, was a common occurrence in medieval Europe, often driven by extreme poverty and the social stigma of illegitimacy. The fear, then, was not just the physical pain of separation, but the profound emotional torment and guilt. Imagine the silent tears, the desperate prayers, and the lingering questions about your child's fate, knowing that you had sacrificed your bond for their potential survival. This was a decision born of ultimate desperation, a testament to the impossible choices forced upon women in your position. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval foundling hospitals would keep records of the clothing or small tokens left with abandoned infants, hoping that mothers might one day return to reclaim them, though such reunions were exceedingly rare. Historians still argue whether the Church's establishment of foundling homes, while seemingly charitable, inadvertently contributed to the practice of abandonment by offering a perceived safe alternative for illegitimate children. Moreover, even if a child was successfully abandoned and survived, the mother's life continued under the shadow of that choice. The emotional scar would likely remain, a constant reminder of the depths to which you had been pushed by societal forces. The grim reality was that your own survival often depended on severing the most fundamental of human bonds. So, for you, a medieval woman in prostitution, the plight of abandoned children was a chilling, personal tragedy, a heartbreaking symbol of the systemic failures that left you with no other viable path, forever marked by a choice no mother should ever have to make. It was like burying a piece of your soul, just so the rest of you could continue to breathe. Beyond the tragic realities of childbirth and abandonment, the lives of medieval women in brothels were constantly imperiled by the presence of pimps and exploiters, a terrifying array of predatory figures who sought to control and profit from their vulnerability. Imagine the chilling presence of individuals who, under the guise of protection or management, systematically stripped you of your autonomy and a fair share of your hard-earned money, wielding power through intimidation and violence. While madames operated the brothels, other figures, often male, functioned as pimps or managers, asserting control over individual women. These exploiters might provide lodging, food, or a measure of protection from other street criminals, but at an exorbitant cost, taking a large percentage of a woman's earnings and often keeping her in perpetual debt. They often used intimidation, physical violence, or threats against a woman's family if she had any to maintain their control, ensuring she remained economically dependent and unable to leave. It's a mainstream historical fact that pimps and exploiters were common figures in the medieval prostitution landscape, preying on vulnerable women and profiting from their labor. The fear, then, was not just of external dangers, but of being perpetually trapped by these predatory figures. You lived under constant surveillance, your movements monitored, your earnings siphoned off. Imagine the desperation of owing money you could never truly repay, knowing that any attempt to escape would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. This created a sense of inescapable bondage, even if you were technically a free woman. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval legal codes, recognizing the problem of procurers' pimps, introduced specific punishments for them, sometimes more severe than for the prostitutes themselves, indicating a societal awareness of the exploitative nature of their role. Historians still argue whether the legal attempts to punish pimps were truly effective in protecting women, or if they merely pushed exploitation further underground and made it harder to detect. Moreover, these exploiters often controlled your access to clients, your working conditions, and your ability to interact with the outside world. They benefited directly from your vulnerability, making any genuine move towards independence incredibly dangerous. Your body was their asset, and they would guard it fiercely, not out of concern, but out of greed. So, for you, a medieval woman in prostitution, the presence of pimps and exploiters added a profound layer of terror to your daily existence, transforming you from a desperate worker into a virtual captive, constantly navigating the arbitrary and often violent whims of those who profited from your despair. It was like having a very aggressive business partner who took all the profits and punched you if you complained. Despite the relentless control of pimps and the constant dangers, some medieval women in brothels found a measure of support and solace through community support, often forging unexpected alliances with other women in the same profession, or with sympathetic individuals on the fringes of society. Imagine the quiet camaraderie, the shared understanding of hardship, and the small acts of kindness that could offer a fleeting sense of solidarity in a world designed to isolate you. While the profession was inherently competitive, survival often depended on mutual aid. Women working in the same brothel or in the same district might form informal networks. They could warn each other of dangerous clients, share information about reliable customers, offer emotional support, or even pool resources in times of extreme need, like illness or a bad streak of business. This informal community provided a crucial buffer against the harshness of their lives, a sense of belonging in a world that otherwise rejected them. It's a mainstream historical fact that marginalized groups, including prostitutes, often developed their own internal support networks and subcultures to cope with societal pressures and dangers. The fear, however, was that these alliances were always fragile and could be easily broken by external pressures or internal betrayals. A new madame, a jealous pimp, or an aggressive client could disrupt the delicate balance of these relationships. Imagine the heartbreak of losing a trusted friend due to circumstances beyond your control, or the constant suspicion that even those you relied on might, out of desperation, turn against you. It's a quirky tidbit that in some medieval literary sources, often satirical or moralizing, there are occasional depictions of prostitutes sharing meals or offering each other advice, suggesting that some form of camaraderie, however idealized, was recognized. Historians still argue whether the bonds formed between women in brothels were primarily pragmatic survival strategies, or if they sometimes evolved into genuine friendships and emotional support systems. Moreover, support could also come from unexpected quarters. Some local tavern owners, innkeepers, or even petty criminals might develop working relationships with women in the trade, offering informal protection or access to resources in exchange for favors or loyalty. While these alliances were transactional, they could nonetheless provide a vital lifeline. So, for you, a medieval woman enduring the brothel life, finding and cultivating these unexpected alliances was a crucial coping mechanism, a way to stitch together a small, fragile safety net in a world that largely offered none. It was like finding a few friendly faces in a very, very unfriendly crowd, a small beacon of shared humanity in a sea of judgment and danger. Despite the comfort of community support, you, as a medieval woman in a brothel, often faced an insurmountable barrier when seeking justice. Legal recourse was incredibly scarce, leaving you with virtually no justice against exploitation or violence. Imagine being wronged, violated, or cheated, and knowing that the very system designed to uphold law and order was largely inaccessible to you, offering little to no protection. In medieval legal systems, women, particularly those outside respectable society, had very limited rights. Prostitutes were often viewed as morally corrupt, and their testimony might be deemed unreliable in court. Even in regulated brothels, the authorities' primary concern was order and revenue, not necessarily the individual welfare of the women. If you were assaulted, cheated, or abused, filing a complaint was fraught with difficulties, risking further public humiliation, retaliation from your aggressor or brothel owner, and often leading nowhere. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval legal systems generally offered very limited protection and recourse for women in prostitution, viewing them through a lens of moral condemnation rather than as victims of crime. The fear, then, was of complete impunity for those who harmed you. Imagine enduring physical violence or theft, knowing that your attacker would likely face no consequences, and that any attempt to seek justice might only bring more trouble upon yourself. This pervasive lack of legal protection created an environment where exploitation thrived, and you were constantly vulnerable. It's a quirky tidbit that in some medieval towns, specific local ordinances existed which, in rare cases, allowed prostitutes to file complaints regarding unpaid fees, suggesting a recognition of their economic transactions, even if their personal safety was less of a concern. Historians still argue whether the occasional legal recognition of prostitutes' economic claims indicated a pragmatic legal approach, or if it further commodified their labor without truly granting them broader legal rights. Moreover, if you managed to bring a case, you would often face skeptical judges and hostile public opinion, the shame of appearing in court, recounting your experiences, and risking further exposure of your profession could be a deterrent in itself. This profound lack of effective legal recourse meant that your survival depended entirely on your own wits, your ability to avoid trouble, and the informal protections of your immediate community, rather than any formal system of justice. So, for you, a medieval woman in a brothel, the law was a distant, unfeeling entity, offering little comfort and even less protection, leaving you to navigate a world where your rights were largely non-existent and your suffering often invisible. To the eyes of justice, it was like living in a game where everyone else had rules, but you were perpetually offside. Amidst the stark absence of legal recourse, you, as a medieval woman in a brothel, were also constantly grappling with the pervasive power of religious views, oscillating between the harsh judgment of sin and redemption. Imagine the internal conflict, the deeply ingrained fear of eternal damnation preached by the Church, contrasting with the desperate hope for divine forgiveness and a path to salvation. Even as your daily life pushed you further into what society deemed sin, the Christian Church in the Middle Ages held an unambiguous stance on prostitution. It was a mortal sin, leading to damnation unless sincerely repented. Priests frequently preached against it, and religious texts reinforced its condemnation. This moral framework permeated every aspect of medieval society, meaning that while some secular authorities tolerated brothels for practical reasons, the spiritual judgment against you was constant and profound. You lived with the burden of knowing your profession was viewed as an affront to God. It's a mainstream historical fact that the medieval church unequivocally condemned prostitution, viewing it as a grave moral transgression. The fear, then, was of eternal punishment. Imagine the dread of facing a judgmental God after death, knowing your life had been spent in a state of sin. This spiritual anxiety could be incredibly powerful, driving some women to intense acts of piety or desperate pleas for forgiveness. It also fueled the internal desire for redemption, however distant or difficult that path might be. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval wills left by women identified as prostitutes included specific clauses requesting elaborate masses be said for their souls, or funding for religious foundations, perhaps as a desperate attempt to mitigate their sins and secure prayers for their salvation. Historians still argue whether the Church's condemnation of prostitution, while morally consistent, inadvertently created a larger class of marginalized women who were trapped in a cycle of sin and despair, or if its emphasis on repentance genuinely offered hope and pathways to reform. However, the Church also preached the possibility of redemption and forgiveness for repentant sinners. This dual message offered a faint glimmer of hope. You might cling to the stories of saints who had overcome sinful pasts, or seek solace from a sympathetic confessor who offered absolution after penance. This hope for redemption was a powerful coping mechanism, allowing you to endure the present. By believing in a potentially better afterlife, or a reformed earthly existence through institutions like Magdalene homes. So, for you, a medieval woman in a brothel, your faith was a complex battleground, constantly weighing the pervasive fear of sin against the desperate, yearning hope for divine mercy, a silent internal struggle amidst the very public condemnation of your life. It was like living under a constant spiritual rain cloud, occasionally seeing a distant rainbow that promised a drier future if you could just make it there. Beyond the internal torment of religious views, the judgment against you as a medieval woman in a brothel was often made brutally explicit through public shaming, leaving visible markers of your outcast status for all to see. Imagine being forced to wear distinctive clothing, to live in a specific area, or even to endure public rituals that branded you as fallen, ensuring that your social condemnation was inescapable. In many medieval towns, authorities, often influenced by moralistic sentiments, sought to visibly distinguish prostitutes from respectable women. This was done through various means, including sumptuary laws that dictated specific colors like yellow, types of clothing, or head coverings that prostitutes had to wear. They might also be required to live in designated districts, often on the outskirts of town, or in clearly marked houses. These measures served not only to control and regulate the profession, but also to publicly humiliate and ostracize the women, ensuring their pariah status was constantly evident. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval authorities in many European cities enforced distinctive dress codes or residential segregation for prostitutes as a form of public identification and shaming. The fear, then, was of the constant, inescapable humiliation. Imagine walking down a street, knowing that your clothing marked you, inviting stares, whispers, and contempt from passers-by. There was no blending in, no escaping the judgment. This public branding reinforced your isolation and made any attempt at social reintegration incredibly difficult. It created a profound sense of shame that permeated every aspect of your public life. It's a quirky tidbit that in some extreme cases, prostitutes might be subjected to public rituals of humiliation, like being paraded through the streets or having their heads shaved, further emphasizing their outcast status and serving as a stark warning to other women. Historians still argue whether these public shaming tactics were genuinely effective in reducing prostitution, or if they primarily served as a means for society to control and punish women who deviated from accepted norms, regardless of their reasons. Moreover, these visible markers meant that even if you left the profession, the memory of your past and the public's perception of it would linger. You were forever associated with the shame of your former life. This constant, public condemnation chipped away at your dignity and self-worth, making every public appearance an ordeal. So, for you, a medieval woman in a brothel, public shaming was a relentless, dehumanizing force, a constant reminder that your society, while perhaps tolerating your existence for its own purposes, simultaneously ensured you bore the indelible mark of its profound disapproval. It was like living with a permanent, very unflattering, public uniform that everyone immediately recognized and judged. While broad societal rules defined the experience of women in prostitution, the actual conditions could vary widely, leading to varying conditions between the bustling urban centers and the quieter rural areas, or even from one establishment to another, demonstrating the subtle differences between city versus country life in the trade. Imagine your daily reality being shaped not just by the general laws, but by the specific local customs, the size of the population, and even the morality of the local lord or town council. In large populous cities like London or Paris, prostitution was often more organized and visible, with designated brothel districts, official regulations, and a constant influx of clients. This could mean a more stable, albeit highly regulated, income, but also greater public scrutiny and more intense competition among women. In contrast, smaller towns or rural areas might see prostitution operating more discreetly, with women working from their homes or in informal arrangements with inns, while potentially offering more personal autonomy and less direct official oversight. These settings often meant fewer clients, more sporadic income, and potentially greater vulnerability to isolated acts of violence or exploitation without the limited protection of a regulated system. It's a mainstream historical fact that the organization and visibility of prostitution varied significantly between medieval, urban, and rural environments, reflecting local economies and social structures. Fear, then, was that your specific locale dictated your opportunities and dangers. In the city, you might fear disease in crowded brothels or the constant eye of the law. In the countryside, you might fear isolation, lack of clients, or the arbitrary power of a single local authority figure. Imagine navigating these different environments, adapting your strategies, and always weighing the benefits of one against the risks of the other. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval women might travel between towns or even regions, following trade routes or seasonal fairs, seeking better opportunities or attempting to escape a problematic situation in one area, highlighting their mobility and adaptability. Historians still argue whether the less regulated nature of rural prostitution genuinely offered more freedom to women, or if it simply made their exploitation less visible to historical record-keepers. Moreover, even within a single city, conditions could vary between a high-end brothel catering to wealthy merchants and a cheap stew serving laborers. The former might offer better living conditions and more stable clientele, while the latter could be rougher, more dangerous, but perhaps more accessible for a woman with fewer options. These variations meant that your personal experience was often a product of subtle geographical and social distinctions. So, for you, a medieval woman in the trade, understanding and adapting to these varying conditions was crucial for survival. A constant calculation of risk and reward based on the very specific corner of the medieval world you inhabited. It was like choosing between different flavors of a very bitter medicine, hoping one might be slightly less unpleasant. Regardless of location, prostitution in the Middle Ages filled a specific economic niche, existing as a necessary evil within the broader urban and even rural landscapes. Imagine your profession, though condemned, being an undeniable part of the social fabric, serving a demand that society, despite its moralizing, was unwilling or unable to suppress entirely. The existence of prostitution, both regulated and illicit, was tolerated by medieval authorities partly because it fulfilled certain societal needs. It provided an outlet for male sexual desire, particularly for unmarried men, travelers, or those who could not afford marriage. By concentrating it in specific areas, authorities also believed they could control crime and prevent the corruption of respectable women. Furthermore, as we've seen, it generated revenue through taxes and fees. This pragmatic approach meant that despite moral condemnation, the profession persisted, often informally accepted as a regrettable but unavoidable part of urban life. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval cities often adopted a pragmatic approach to prostitution, regulating it as a necessary evil rather than attempting total prohibition. The fear, then, was that your necessity was only ever conditional, tied to this ongoing demand. If societal needs or political priorities shifted, your tolerated status could instantly disappear, leaving you vulnerable to sudden crackdowns or increased persecution. Imagine being useful one day, only to be deemed utterly expendable the next, with no true security. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval theologians, despite condemning prostitution, paradoxically argued that it served a function in society by preventing worse sins, such as rape or sodomy, a truly strange justification for the continued existence of the trade. Historians still argue whether the concept of prostitution as a necessary evil primarily served to excuse male behavior and control female sexuality. or if it genuinely reflected a societal attempt to manage unavoidable social realities. Moreover, your role as a necessary evil meant you were constantly walking a tightrope. You were indispensable to a certain segment of the male population and to the coffers of those who taxed you, but you were simultaneously viewed with disdain and disgust by the moral majority. This duality was a constant psychological burden. You were needed, but never respected. So, for you, a medieval woman in prostitution, your existence was defined by this uncomfortable paradox, a crucial, yet reviled, part of the medieval economic and social landscape. It was like being a crucial, but heavily soiled, cog in a very judgmental machine, constantly aware of your indispensable yet despised role. Within the grim confines of your existence, amidst the constant threats and societal scorn, you, as a medieval woman in a brothel, might occasionally experience a fleeting taste of fleeting freedom, a kind of temporary autonomy that offered a precious, albeit brief, respite from your pervasive control. Imagine a rare evening when a kind client treated you with respect, or a moment when you managed to keep a little extra money for yourself, feeling a surge of defiant self-possession, while overarching control by madames or pimps was the norm, and societal stigma ever present. There were small windows where a degree of personal agency could be asserted. This might involve choosing a particular client, negotiating a slightly higher price if conditions allowed, or deciding how you spent the meager portion of your earnings that remained after deductions. For women who were largely disempowered, even these minor acts of choice could feel significant, offering a psychological sense of control over a life largely dictated by others. It's a mainstream historical fact that while deeply exploited, individuals in marginalized professions often found subtle ways to exert personal agency within their constrained circumstances. The fear, however, was that this freedom was always provisional and easily revoked. Any assertion of independence could be met with swift punishment or increased surveillance. Imagine the constant calculation. How much autonomy could you risk, and for what reward? A moment of defiance could cost you your livelihood, or worse. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval court records surprisingly show instances where prostitutes would collectively refuse to work on certain days or for certain clients, suggesting a rare, albeit dangerous, exercise of collective agency against oppressive conditions. Historians still argue whether such acts of temporary autonomy were genuinely empowering, or if they were largely symbolic gestures that did little to fundamentally alter the women's overall subjugation. Moreover, true freedom, the freedom to leave the profession, to marry without stigma, to live a life of respect remained largely out of reach for most. The fleeting freedom was just that, a fleeting moment, a temporary reprieve from the crushing realities of your life, a small psychological victory rather than a true liberation. So, for you, a medieval woman enduring the brothel, these tiny glimmers of autonomy were cherished, a reminder that your spirit, however beleaguered, still yearned for choice, even as the walls of your existence pressed in. It was like getting a brief breath of fresh air in a very stuffy room, just enough to remind you what you were missing. These fleeting moments of personal choice, however small, hint at a deeper yearning for personal agency, where medieval women in brothels engaged in small acts of resistance against the overwhelming forces that sought to control their lives. Imagine the quiet defiance in a knowing glance, a whispered shared secret, or the subtle manipulation of expectations, carving out minuscule pockets of self-determination in an otherwise oppressive existence. While overt rebellion was incredibly risky and rare, Resistance often manifested in subtle, everyday ways. This could involve secretly hiding small sums of money from a pimp, subtly influencing clients to gain favor or better terms, deliberately flouting minor rules when supervision was lax, or supporting fellow women in defiance of a madame's authority. These weren't grand gestures of revolution, but quiet assertions of self, attempts to reclaim dignity and control where little existed. It's a mainstream historical fact that marginalized individuals throughout history have often employed subtle, everyday forms of resistance to navigate oppressive systems. The fear, of course, was always discovery and the harsh consequences that would follow. Any act of defiance, however minor, carried the risk of severe punishment, ranging from beatings and fines to outright expulsion, which would leave you utterly destitute. Imagine the careful planning, the constant vigilance, and the pounding heart as you executed a small act of defiance, knowing that freedom could turn into brutal retribution in an instant. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval women in brothels would develop their own slang or coded language, allowing them to communicate discreetly among themselves, sharing information and strengthening their solidarity against exploiters without being understood by outsiders. Historians still argue whether these small acts of resistance genuinely improved the women's conditions, or if their primary function was psychological, allowing them to maintain a sense of self-worth and identity in a dehumanizing environment. Moreover, these acts, while seemingly insignificant, were crucial for maintaining a sense of self and preventing complete psychological surrender. They were a testament to the human spirit's enduring desire for autonomy, even in the most constrained circumstances. Each small victory, each successful defiance, however minor, chipped away at the suffocating weight of powerlessness. So, for you, a medieval woman in a brothel, your survival wasn't just about physical endurance, but about the quiet, persistent battle for your own identity. Fought one small act of resistance at a time, a constant whisper of "I am still here," and "I am still me" against a world that tried to erase you. It was like subtly redecorating your prison cell, a tiny rebellion against the architecture of your captivity. Despite these small acts of resistance and fleeting moments of agency, the overarching reality for medieval women in brothels was a life defined by long-term prospects that were bleak, offering an uncertain future at best. Imagine living day by day, knowing that escape was a distant dream for most, and that old age, illness, or simply a decline in desirability could plunge you into an even deeper abyss of poverty and despair. For the vast majority of women in prostitution, there was no retirement plan, no pension, and certainly no social security. Their profession was physically demanding and emotionally draining, and as they aged, or if their health deteriorated, their ability to attract clients and earn a living would diminish rapidly. This meant a constant threat of utter destitution. In their later years, facing an old age without support, potentially ending in beggary, homelessness, or death in a poor house. It's a mainstream historical fact that the long-term prospects for women in prostitution were generally grim, with many facing poverty and hardship as they aged or became unable to work. The fear, then, was of a slow, inevitable decline into abject misery. Imagine looking at older women in the trade, or those who had been cast out, and seeing your own terrifying future reflected in their struggles. This pervasive dread of an unsupported old age must have been a powerful motivator, driving the desperate attempts to save money or find a new path, however unlikely. It's a quirky tidbit that in some medieval towns, almshouses, or charitable foundations might occasionally admit elderly or infirm former prostitutes, but these spots were exceedingly rare and highly competitive, offering little comfort to the vast majority. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates among medieval prostitutes meant that few lived long enough to face the challenges of old age in the profession, or if their earlier deaths were a direct result of the harsh conditions and lack of long-term care. Moreover, the social stigma meant that even if you saved money, a respectable retirement was largely out of reach. You might be able to buy a small dwelling, but social acceptance and reintegration into the mainstream community would likely remain elusive. Your past would always haunt you, limiting your options and ensuring a degree of isolation. So, for you, a medieval woman enduring the brothel life, the future was a vast, uncertain expanse, perpetually shadowed by the terrifying spectre of destitution. A constant reminder that your survival was always temporary and ultimate security remained an elusive dream. It was like running a marathon that never ended, and the finish line kept moving further away. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the constant dangers, the pervasive stigma, and the bleak long-term prospects, the defining characteristic of many medieval women who survived in brothels was their incredible enduring resilience, finding ways to push back against all odds. Imagine the sheer tenacity of spirit, the unwavering will to survive that allowed you to navigate a world designed to break you, and to emerge, however scarred, with your humanity intact. This resilience manifested in countless ways, both big and small. It was in the daily act of waking up and facing another day of work, despite the degradation and fear. It was in the small acts of resistance, the quiet assertion of personal agency, the cleverness employed to outwit exploiters or avoid detection. It was in the ability to form unexpected alliances, finding strength and solace in community with others who shared your plight. And it was in the enduring hope for a better future, whether through saving for a dowry, seeking redemption in a Magdalene home, or simply dreaming of a life beyond the brothel's walls. It's a mainstream historical fact that women in marginalized positions throughout history have consistently demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability in the face of extreme adversity. The fear, while ever present, never entirely extinguished. The spark of life and the will to persevere. Imagine the mental fortitude required to compartmentalize trauma, to find moments of joy or connection amidst suffering, and to maintain a sense of self-worth when society constantly told you that you had none. This internal strength was your ultimate armor against a cruel world. It's a quirky tidbit that some medieval proverbs or folk tales, surprisingly, contained elements that acknowledged the cleverness or resourcefulness of women of the night, perhaps reflecting a grudging popular recognition of their survival skills, despite moral condemnation. Historians still argue whether the resilience of women in prostitution was a form of active empowerment, or if it simply enabled them to endure exploitation within a system they could not fundamentally change. Ultimately, your story, as a medieval woman in a brothel, is a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. You were a survivor, navigating unimaginable hardships with ingenuity, courage, and a powerful, enduring will to live. You faced down poverty, violence, disease, and relentless social condemnation, often with no legal protection and little hope of escape. Yet, you found ways to endure, to resist, and to maintain a flicker of hope against the darkest of backdrops. Your life was a brutal, unwritten epic of survival, a testament to the hidden strengths found in the most unexpected corners of medieval society. Now, as the echoes of these medieval lives begin to fade, let your mind gently drift from the cobbled streets and flickering lamplight of those ancient towns. Allow the images of struggle and resilience to soften, to become merely a whisper on the edges of your awareness. The weight of their past is no longer yours to carry, only the quiet understanding of their endurance. Feel the comforting darkness of your room, the soft hum of the fan, a steady rhythm guiding you deeper into tranquility. Let any remaining thoughts or anxieties dissipate like mist, dissolving into the quiet stillness of the night. Your own world, your own bed is a place of safety now. The stories have been told, the journey is complete. Rest deeply and find peace in the quiet of this moment. Sweet dreams.